Welcome everyone to this evening's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at MSU, formerly Wonderlust, presentation, The Patient as Citizen, Healthcare, Politics, and Autonomy. OLLI at MSU presentations with the Belgrade Community Library are free and open to the public thanks to a generous sponsorship by Kenyon Noble Lumber and Hardware. If you have questions about other OLLI at MSU programs or membership with OLLI, let me know and I will get you connected to one of the OLLI at MSU volunteers that are logged on to tonight's presentation. My name is Sara Rushing, and I'm the Adult Services Librarian at the Belgrade Community Library. And before I introduce our presenter, a few announcements and how-to tips for Zoom. I know you're probably all very used to this, but just in case there's someone who hasn't used it before. Your videos, cameras, and your microphones are both disabled for this presentation. And questions will be taken using both the chat and the raise hand functions. If you'd like to ask using your voice, choose the raise hand option and I will open up your microphone and you can ask. If you'd rather ask your question over chat, that's fine. I will collect them and use your first name when asking on your behalf. I will monitor the chat throughout the talk, and if there are any clarifying questions about the content currently being presented, I will interrupt our presenter. If it's more of a general question, I will collect those and wait till the end, just so we can get all of the information presented and then have a maybe lively discussion. If you're not sure of terminology or want something more expanded on, that's what I mean by clarifying questions. So feel free to make sure it's clear that you want more information about anything like that. The chat section is where you can let me know if you're having technical issues as well. If you want all of the attendees to see your question as well in the chat, make sure you change the to all panelists and attendees. And that's also where you can see who else is logged on tonight, I'm pretty sure. So if that's not true, somebody can let me know. To use the chat, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a speech bubble and you can click on that and it'll open on the right side of your screen if you're not in full screen mode. But if you are, it'll appear kind of in the middle of your window and you can drag it around by clicking the top bar of the window. To type your message, open the chat and click the text that says type message here. Start typing and your message should appear where that text was. To send, press enter or return. Closed captioning is available if you want to see the words on your screen, and it's provided by a third-party AI service, so forgive any errors. To use this feature, press the CC button and choose View Subtitle, and it should show up at the bottom. This evening's event is being recorded for the library's YouTube channel and the OLLI at MSU archive. You will receive a link with the recording when it's available if you registered through the OLLI at MSU website, which I think everybody did. And then finally, please take a minute to complete the survey that will pop up after the event is over. This helps the library, the sponsors, and OLLI at MSU know what programs bring the most interest, and it helps us improve every time. And since we can't see your smiling faces, it helps us know if you enjoyed the talk. So finally, really, tonight's presenter is an associate professor of political science at MSU Bozeman. She specializes in democratic and feminist political theory and is particularly interested in the politics of the body and healthcare as a site of citizenship development. Please give a warm, albeit silent, welcome to our speaker, Dr. Sara Rushing. And it's my pleasure to turn it over to you, Sara. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Sara Rushing for organizing and to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for sponsoring these talks and inviting me in the Belgrade Public Library. I am coming to you from my office on the MSU campus, where you can see the 75-degree sun dropping down outside my window, creating this nice romantic lighting effect. But if you're here joining me tonight, I really want to extend a special thanks, since this is like the most beautiful day we've had of the year. And I really appreciate you being here with me to spend your evening doing a little bit of thinking. I'm excited to talk to you this evening. I'm also hopeful that I can talk with you some. So I want to leave time at the end to try to have some interpersonal engagement, despite the fact that in the world of COVID, life is virtual and remote. And I was just saying to Sarah that while I've done quite a lot of online teaching this year, I actually haven't given a dedicated online lecture, and it's interesting, to talk into the void. So I'm going to imagine all your faces out there smiling and nodding and giving me a thumbs up, or looking quizzical and typing in a question. And in that way, we will be here together until we can be really together someplace else soon, I hope. I think it's helpful when I start a talk, or when anyone starts a talk to a general audience, to offer kind of a big picture explanation of what they do. And so I'm going to start there talking about, sort of as a scholar and a teacher, a little bit of what Sarah offered in my bio. But first, I want to just offer a note about how I'm going to give this talk. I'm going to use slides. And so my face will be in this little corner instead of my face being what's talking to you, and the slides will be what you watch. I am not known for being an aesthetic genius when it comes to PowerPoint. So some of my slides will have visuals, some will just have lots of words. That is often helpful, I find, when I'm reading a quote, or when I'm making a specific point, which, as a political theorist, a philosopher, is what I tend to do. So I apologize if they're not pretty, and I apologize if there are too many, and I hope they are helpful, and thanks for bearing with me. And I always welcome any feedback on how to make PowerPoint presentations more exciting. Believe me, my students have tons and tons of feedback about how to make them more exciting. I've tried to steer away in this talk today from too much jargon. But please, as Sarah said, feel free to post requests for clarification to the chat as we go. I hope you'll have some sort of bigger picture questions at the end, but if I lose you somewhere on the way, I am sure you are not alone. So please don't hesitate to ask me to just stop and explain. And Sarah will sort of field those requests and pass them along to me. So with those disclaimers, that's me. Professionally, I am, as Sarah mentioned, a political theorist, which means I'm in a department of political science. I'm a faculty member and a teacher. And I'm a democratic theorist, and I'm a feminist theorist. And so as a political theorist, I'm really interested in questions about power and knowledge and resource distribution. As a democratic theorist, I'm really interested in questions about equality and liberty and citizen participation. And as a feminist theorist, I'm really interested in questions about gender and embodiment and self-determination. And all of those threads are going to weave together today into my talk. So that helps you kind of situate yourself. I was joking with Sarah that I think she got a couple questions in advance of the talk, and some of them were kind of medical. And I thought, oh no, they think I'm a real doctor. And I'm a real doctor, but you wouldn't want me, to welcome you into the ER. And so I have real doctor friends that I've consulted with, but I'm a PhD in political science. And these are the things that I study. I'm also an author. This is the cover of my recent book that just came out in November, The Virtues of Vulnerability, Humility, Autonomy, and Citizen Subjectivity. And the basic premise of this book, which informs how I think about all the questions I'm going to talk about today, is that contemporary healthcare is never simply about care. It's not just a private site of personal choice and control over our treatment. Healthcare is a complex, kind of overlapping web of institutional forces. It's a complex, what I call medical, legal, policy, insurance nexus. And as such, it certainly is driven by medical concerns, but it's also driven by a lot of other concerns. And that nexus itself makes it so that healthcare has many political dimensions. So today I'm going to talk about some of the questions I raise in my book, but I'm not going to really get into the core of the book, which focuses on giving birth, on navigating death and dying, and on veterans seeking treatment for combat-related PTSD within the VA mental health care complex. I'm happy in the Q&A to say more about those specific medical contexts, sort of why I chose those three to explore. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but not too much. So I'm happy to say more why I explore them, how I analyze them as what I call sites of potential political awakening, and what they have to do with humility, autonomy, and citizen subjectivity, which are the words you see on the cover. And I think there may be a few people here who I know who have read the book. And I'll say honestly that one of the comments I frequently get is, I really like the book. I still don't get citizen subjectivity. And so I'm really happy to sort of dive in on that because it will lurk in this talk, even if I don't directly address it. So that's kind of to pepper you with some things we could come back to in the Q&A. So for now, I'm going to orient my comments around some loose ends that linger from this book project. Any really great intellectual endeavor leaves you with more questions than it solves. That's definitely the case for me. So when I got to the end of my conclusion, there were all these questions that, oh, okay, now I know what I want to ask. So I'm going to consider some of those threads. And this is partly because they remain open questions for me. I'm still actively thinking about them, and I'd love to engage with you all about these questions. And then it's partly because the issues that I end the book with in the concluding chapter have a whole new relevance. I mean, the book came out in November, so certainly came out in the COVID time. It was done about a year before that, so just really before last December, so just before the world fundamentally changed in many ways. But the issues raised in the book have this, serious contemporary relevance given the COVID moment we're all living through. So that's why that's sort of where my head is now and why I want to talk about those things. So if healthcare is a site of politics, and I argue it is, how does our experience navigating the clinic? The clinic is a term from Michel Foucault, who was a French philosopher of medicine, among many other things. And it's a concept that kind of embeds a lot of dimensions of medicine. So institutional mainstream American medicine, the clinic, right? We might call it the hospital. The sociologist Wendy Simons calls it hospital land USA, that kind of terrain in the United States. How does our experience navigating that terrain inform our sense of ourselves as participatory agents? So another way of asking that question, kind of a broader way of asking that question, is to ask, how do health and citizenship go together? So first and foremost, when we ask how health and citizenship go together, what comes to mind is probably how that where you live really impacts what kind of healthcare you can access. So where you are a citizen has profound effects on what kind of resources and what kind of healthcare system you take for granted. So that can be from countries with universal free healthcare to impoverished nations dependent on foreign nonprofits to bring supplies and expertise that's chronically lacking, right? So citizenship can really very literally impact your health. But I'm interested in thinking about this question of health and citizenship and how they go together in a slightly different way as a political theorist, and particularly looking at how they've entwined in the United States and how that has changed over time. So traditionally, we've thought about this interconnection between healthcare and citizenship as the nation, has a responsibility to care for the health of its citizens, and citizens have a right to certain care and a responsibility to care for their own health for the good of the nation. So good health is part of good citizenship. And again, what constitutes good health has historical dimensions, has changed over time. In the history of the United States, there has been time when good health is robust, right? Extra meat on your bones, robust, productive, strong laborers, high output, reproductive, right? Women's fertility has often been deeply intertwined with their conception, with what kind of citizens they're regarded as being, and that's can be like a very racialized conception as well. Responsible citizens take care of their good health, so healthy means responsible. In recent years, we've heard a lot of discourse about resilience, and so good citizens may encounter adversive events. They may have health challenges, but they are resilient, they bounce back, and that's what makes someone a good citizen, right? They're resilient or resistant, right? So today we have this whole new way of thinking about health and citizenship through the lens of debates about vaccinations. And so resistant citizens become good, healthy citizens. And you can picture, I can imagine many of you can picture what some of these things would look like as kind of glossy, patriotic, posters from various nations and eras in our 20th century history, promoting these images of the good citizen and what it looks like. And we have a lot of that discourse in the contemporary United States, just in the last 10 or 15 years, forever, but really prominently in the last 10 or 15 years. So this is John Mackey. He is the CEO of Whole Foods, and he wrote a editorial for the Wall Street Journal in 2009 as kind of a part of a critique of Obamacare, the pending Affordable Care Act, where he said, John Mackey is a noted libertarian, and he said, rather than increase government spending and control, we need to address the root causes of poor health. This begins with the realization that every American adult is responsible for his or her own health. And of course, it's hard not to kind of chuckle at that bold proclamation by someone who owns a health food store of a franchise of which we will have in Bozeman sometime soon. So if you haven't been very responsible, feel free to go down to Whole Foods and start being responsible for your own health. Another contemporary example of this kind of discourse. This is Mo Brooks, representative from Alabama, in 2017, just after Trump was elected and they were starting to figure out how to roll back the Affordable Care Act. Mo Brooks said was quoted in a newspaper saying, we should all just decide to be one of those people who lead good lives. They're healthy. They've done things to keep their body healthy. And, we can trace this concept all the way back to Benjamin Franklin, who tells us an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So two things to note about, this statement by Mo Brooks. He said this just a few months before he publicly announced his diagnosis of prostate cancer, which is a very, common cancer, and for which no one is personally responsible in my account. But it is interesting to think about how he framed that after basically saying people who get sick should have to pay more for healthcare because they're a burden. And that's just how an economic market works. If you cost more, you pay more. And then the other thing I want to note about this is, of course, there's nothing wrong with having, taking care of ourselves. Like, we have the quote unquote American diet is not great, and it causes people a lot of health problems, and stress is a major killer, and a global pandemic doesn't help. So, I'm not saying we're all off the hook for tending to ourselves at all, but the discourse of personal responsibility as it shapes up in the context of thinking about the American healthcare system is saying, I think, something slightly different than, hey, would it kill you to eat a little broccoli now and again? Okay. So how do we think about health and citizenship traditionally? As a kind of a healthy citizen is good for the nation, is active in their care, is not passive, not docile. And that conception of health and citizenship really differs from how we've traditionally thought of the concept of the patient. So traditionally, the patient has been understood as a passive and cooperative receiver of the treatment that is doled out to them by an authoritative and benevolent medical professional. Patient comes from the Latin patiens. I don't speak Latin. I'm willing to guess most of you don't either, so we're going to go with my pronunciation, patiens, right? So the one who endures or suffers without complaint. And so what you see is, the patient and the citizen here seem to part ways very much so in terms of their traits and dispositions, their defining characteristics, right? The good patient traditionally is not an active participant. That has been changing quite a lot in the late 20th century. And now we would think of the patient as being an activist. We have lots of health activism or health citizenship movements that tell a very different story about patients, right? So patient is activist, they're a self-advocate, they're a participant in their own care. Patients are health citizens, right? They're not just people who care about their health in the context of citizenshiip, but people who care about their citizen activism in the context of their health. They're informed consenters, right? They kind of are rational consenters to the care being given to them, and they're savvy consumers, so they can navigate information and they can navigate health as a marketplace and make informed decisions about which products or services they choose to consume. That's a lot of the dominant discourse about what the patient is today. So to sum that up, the patient is pitched as something like an autonomous choice maker, right? And there are examples of many of the legal reforms that brought about this shift in the 20th century. Just a couple, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, I think EMTLA is how they say it, right? So 1986, which guaranteed people the right to access emergency services regardless of whether they could pay, and said they couldn't be transferred to other hospitals if it would put their health at risk, or for example, if you're a woman in active labor, the hospital you go to has to take you in the emergency room rather than saying, gosh, if you can't pay, we're gonna make sure you move down to county, right? So that was a really key piece of legislation giving patients some rights and responsibilities. The Patient Self-Determination Act of 1990, which really started, articulated a conception of patient autonomy and the right to ask for and refuse certain treatments. The American with Disabilities Act in 1990, stipulating what kind of treatment people with disabilities, not only in the world, but within healthcare, had rights to, and what kind of discrimination they could be protected against. HIPAA, which guaranteed, medical privacy and also access to medical records. And then the Affordable Care Act in 2010. And in many states, in the United States, though by no means all, nor even close to a majority, right to die laws, which give people control over their death and dying. So that's just a brief set of examples of some of the healthcare reforms that centered the patient in healthcare in the 20th and 21st century in the United States. And we can think about the changes that these reforms represented and brought about as a shift from a framework of benevolent paternalism to a framework of patient autonomy. And that shift from benevolent paternalism to patient autonomy is really important. I mean, in so many ways that represents progress from the old model where you were this passive sufferer kind of being treated as an object to be kind of cured and not a participant, not a person to participate in the decision-making about your care. So that shift is really important. And I want to argue that that shift can be problematic. To the extent that it can overcorrect, it frequently overcorrects in regards to the promise of patient choice and control. So how does it overcorrect? What does that mean to say that there are some risks attendant to a highly patient-centered or patient autonomy-centered healthcare model? So for one, also, you are seeing the height of my incredible PowerPoint skills with stuff dissolving in and flying in. That is, I'm extremely proud of that, so I hope you are enjoying it. So one, we may be led to believe we have more choice and control than we actually have, right? So if you have this discourse of patient autonomy, this discourse of choice and control in your medical care, and you've just been diagnosed with cancer, you didn't choose that, and all the things that flow from it really don't feel to many people like choices, even if they have to make some decisions. So there's this discourse of choice and control that really can be disorienting or ring really hollow with patients, and they're being told that they have choice and control, and really frequently people don't feel like they do. So that's one way this overcorrection might be problematic. A second way is it might lead us to want or demand more choice and control that makes sense in a particular medical circumstance. So if you have any friends who are doctors who see patients on a regular basis, they may have told you about patients who come in having seen pharmaceutical commercials and say, oh, I want that. You have to give me that medication. I think that's what's right for me. Or patients who, are suffering from diseases and they want, treatments that are not really indicated for their particular, embodiment of that disease. So this discourse of patient autonomy, this discourse of patient self-determination, choice and control can lead us to ask for control over our care when really we may need to be deferring to medical authorities who are in a better position to kind of help us. Right. And so somewhere between, straight up benevolent paternalism and absolute patient self-determination is usually where patients find themselves. And then third, we may feel frustrated for not knowing how to make choices or failures for not wanting control. When I had my first child, who's now my 13-year-old daughter, I was 34 when I was pregnant. I was going to have her at 35. And so I was determined to be a geriatric pregnancy, right? I was advanced maternal age. And so my doctor at the time sent me down to see a perinatologist who I consulted with about sort of the risks posed by being elderly when you birthed. And, we discussed whether I would have an amniocentesis or not. So now there are far less invasive and far less risky ways of determining whether your baby to be has any genetic challenges or defects, right? Problems that you might want to know about as a parent. But at the time, the amniocentesis was the best science. And of course, it involves a giant needle going into your abdomen. And there's a risk of miscarriage. And I really didn't want to have one, of course, but I didn't know how to make that decision. And so the perinatalogist gave me a lot of statistics, and I nodded like a good student that I was. And then I sort of said to him, well, taking all these things into consideration, what would you do? And he looked at me and he said, well, I can't tell you what I would do, and I can't tell you. But here are all the statistics again, and here are some more statistics. And I nodded and I said, okay, well, pretend I'm your daughter and you're a perinatologist. What would you tell me? And he said, well, I really can't tell you. And I just thought, I totally get that you're respecting my autonomy and you're leaving the choice in my hands so that I have control, but I don't want it. I don't, tell me what to do. I don't know what to do. And so I ended up feeling like this is a form of freedom that feels like a real mixed blessing to me. And I think a lot of people encounter that in healthcare, that there's this kind of, I am here to just present you with all the options, but really it's ultimately for you to pick. And that's great if you have some context for knowing how to make that decision. But if you don't, it can feel really like you're failing to be a good health citizen because you really just want someone to tell you, here's what I do if I was you. Okay, so ways in which the overcorrection from benevolent paternalism to patient autonomy can create these unintended effects for patients. So to sort of sum up what I'm talking about so far, we might have no idea as we enter the clinic or we enter Hospital Land USA, frequently not by choice, we might have no idea how to be a good patient or a good health citizen. And we might be trying to figure that out against our desires in a context that feels novel, confusing, and extraordinarily vulnerable. And even if we try our hardest to be rational and autonomous agents who plan and strive to be self-directing and responsible, our bodies might have their own plans. In my book, I write about childbirth, and I talk a lot about the birth plan. And the birth plan is a very popular way to sort of say, okay, here's, in this moment where I'm in labor and I really can't, I'm not going to be in a position to be making sort of rational choices about my care. Here are the things that are important to me. And I think a birth plan is a great idea. And I also know that sometimes your body has, other ideas about what's going to happen, and you can't make it read your birth plan, right? You can ask the doctors and nurses and your midwife or whoever to read your birth plan, but you can't tell your body, hey, this is what I said was going to happen. So sometimes our bodies have their own plans, despite our best efforts to be good health citizens, right? And so here I want to sort of shift from this story I'm telling so far about how health and citizenship intertwine and how that has changed over time to consider a little bit of the backstory that's relevant to me as a political theorist and sort of how I think about these things, and hopefully will be interesting to you. And, long story short, the backstory is that the body has always posed a problem for Western thought. Western thought has lots of tendrils, but political theory, philosophy, theology in particular, right? All the way back to the origins of our intellectual traditions in the West, the body has been a problem. And so that's not anything new in and of itself. This is a slide I use when I teach my students Plato's Republic. This is a way of showing what Plato's tripartite, his three-part soul, looks like. And what I want to draw your attention to is, Plato's soul has these three parts: the rational part, which is the mind, which is where the virtue of wisdom takes shape; the spirited part, which is like the heart, where courage, the virtue of courage, attaches; and then the appetitive part, which is the belly, which is where the virtue of moderation becomes important. In the Republic, if you've read it, you know that Plato uses the tripartite soul in the human body as a way of sort of a metaphor, or sort of an analogy for the three parts of the city: the elites who rule rationally, the spirited warriors who are courageous and protect the city, and the masses who are, they're at their best when they obey, right? And, so the belly is supposed to obey, the heart is supposed to obey, and the brain is supposed to rule, right? So the body is the problem, which the mind is tasked with controlling, right? And, that is in the Greek story. In the modern liberal tradition. I don't know if any of my former students are here, but if they are, I'm gonna just wait 2 seconds before I fill in this slide because they have seen it so many times. I want to give them a chance to remember what this represents. Okay, that should be long enough. Reason plus freedom equals progress. That's sort of the defining narrative of the modern liberal tradition, right? Where if we use our rationality and we're sort of set free to publicly put our reason to work with others, we will progress society and progress science and progress politics and government. And so it's all an upward march towards perfection if we can just be rational and free. And so, what I'm drawing your attention to here is that the defining narrative, both classical Greek political theory and modern liberal political theory, involves self-mastery, right? A kind of mind over matter that makes rationality the preeminent trait of humans and makes embodiment a threat to being rational. And of course, I've kind of skipped entirely over the Christian and medieval and early modern political thought and theology, but the sins of the flesh, right, is one of the main things that humans have to struggle with on earth as the price of salvation, right? So again, the body in the Christian tradition becomes the soul, the prison of the soul. And a body well tended to, the soul is set free ultimately to ascend to glory, right? So, okay, so those are some of our dominant political theory stories that I teach when I teach classical political thought, when I teach modern political thought. And, they have a lot of interesting dimensions, just kind of intellectually and historically, and they have a lot of things that I admire and seek to, attain in my own life and when I think about politics. But the fact is, we know that not all bodies or not all embodied people have equal access to this ideal of rationality. And so this is a very busy slide that is just intended to sort of remind us of the bodies for whom, rational agency has often been either denied or not believed to be available to, right? So bodies that are too big or too small, pregnant bodies, women's bodies, right? Women were traditionally considered to be undiagnosed with hysteria. And of course, the treatment for hysteria for many years was a hysterectomy, right? Remove that wandering womb and the crazy lady will become at least a little more rational, right? Poor people are considered to be driven by their bellies and not their brains, right? Because they have need. Gay people, right? For whom we historically in the United States have associated with their sexual passions as kind of the defining characteristic of who they are as a person, right? Children are pre-rational. Ideally, they ultimately become rational in our narrative of development, but they're pre-rational. And veterans, right, which I think is just a really kind of a confounding example. I have a whole chapter on veterans in my book. And I think it's really a challenge for us as a country to think about how the warrior becomes the wounded warrior and how we as a society are responsible for, have a duty to address and how we're not, we haven't done a great job addressing that duty in many ways. And then finally, Black bodies are considered to be not able to access rationality the same way white bodies are. And I want to draw your attention particularly to this slide at the bottom. That's a still photo from D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, one of the first moving pictures in the United States. And what's telling about this picture is that is a white person in blackface. And that is so because, the Black male body, as it was objectified in the South in the post-slavery era, was considered to be so rapacious that you couldn't have a Black actor cast in this role. You had to have a white actor in blackface because that actor could sort of control himself around the women actresses who were in this scene. And so really, this is not ancient history in any way that we see certain bodies as sort of generic individuals, rational agents, right? Citizens with a capital C, and a lot of other bodies that deviate from that norm. And deviate from that norm with a real cost, right? So the real or perceived vulnerability of certain bodies has traditionally had profound effects. In politics, that has had effects in terms of who gets rights, who can own property, who can vote, etc. And in healthcare, a range of embodied people have had challenges in being susceptible to make decisions for themselves, right? Which is a huge part of disability rights activism, right? I get to decide this for myself. No, nothing about me without me, right? So who gets to make decisions and whose body counts as normal and whose body needs to be cured or fixed versus cared for and left be. And then in healthcare is a side of politics where that all comes together. So bodily vulnerability has traditionally had social and political costs. And in exploring in my book how people undergo childbirth, death and dying, and mental illness within the American medical legal policy insurance nexus, or Hospital Land USA, or the clinic, I sought to dig deep into those specific contexts. So I really wanted to kind of get into the nitty gritty and map in detail what goes on, for example, in childbirth, how medical norms and institutional practices and treatment protocols and choice architectures get shaped in that context. And I wanted to do that really by looking at a ton of statistics and practices and trends to give people who haven't been through that experience themselves or with anyone else, which, most of us don't spend a lot of our time watching childbirth, so they can really get their head around what it involves. I really wanted to understand how patients are guided and informed at the end of their lives if they want to stop curative treatments and move to hospice before they're on death's doorstep. The 35% of Americans who go into hospice go in for less than a week. So really at that point, there's no time, there's not a lot of time to make your way down the path to death on your own, right? It's a very short clock at that point. So I wanted to think about what does that process look like? What medical, legal, policy, insurance pressures are at work behind the scenes of the doctor-patient relationship as a patient requests or is encouraged to consider hospice. And then with regard to veterans with PTSD, I really was interested in what happens when they don't want to sort of submit to the gold standard forms of therapy that are offered through the VA, particularly prolonged exposure therapy, right? Confronting your traumas over and over to sort of to sensitize to them, or other forms of cognitive behavioral interventions. So if they didn't want to do those things and they didn't want to kind of live their lives on a major pharmaceutical cocktail, which many veterans describe feeling like zombies under the kind of dominant treatment protocols. So what did it look like in kind of all the detail as they figured out how to seek other forms of treatment within the confines of the VA or against it, outside of it. So I wanted to kind of look at those areas because I wanted to map them out in detail. Also, there's overwhelming anecdotal evidence and scholarly evidence showing that these three major life events, birth, dying, and kind of reintegrating after severe mental illness or PTSD trauma, that they're just not going well in the United States. We could be doing these things so much better. They are all associated with extremely high cost and really low satisfaction and outcomes. Not everyone, right? So as I say in my book, if you have gone through these experiences and you've had a good experience, great. I do not want to, undermine that at all. But I'm really talking to the people who've gone through these experiences and come out thinking, what just happened? I was told over and over, I had all this choice and control. And then that is not at all what my experience felt like. And I'm really disoriented and I feel like I failed as a medical subject and I didn't get the care I wanted and I consented to things I wouldn't have. And, it can be very demoralizing. It can really make them feel like they tried to be a good citizen, a good agent and weren't able to. So we're not doing some of these things really well. And that certainly goes well beyond birth, death, and illness. So I wanted to explore them for that reason, to make some suggestions about how they could be better, or at least think about why they're going wrong. But I also wanted to explore them in minute detail to show, how the asymmetrical power and knowledge at work in these contexts shapes up. These contexts that are, pitched to us as very personal and private, but are in fact often quite public and very political. And how a lot of the pressures at work there have really nothing to do with medicine. That is, when I think I discovered that as a patient in various contexts of my life, I was surprised and dismayed. And so I really wanted to sort of make that case, and certainly leave it open for people to challenge it, but I wanted to make that case. Having said all of that, the other reason I wanted to engage with these areas is because they are intense, they are often rare, they are totally normal human events. We all are going to undergo experiences like these, if not these exact experiences at some point in our lives, right? We are all born into bodies, we will all die in bodies, no matter how much energy we spend trying to make good choices. And so much as bodily vulnerability really does attach to some bodies more than others, and much as in our most normal and healthy moments, we want to cast extreme bodily vulnerability as the exception, not the rule. What I wanted to suggest in this book is that really vulnerability is the rule in our lives, and what kind of politics might shape up, outside of the clinic, outside of healthcare, if we were able to recognize that. So if we accept that vulnerability is just a feature of being a human living in a body, and being in relation to other people on whom we depend deeply, often physically, emotionally, economically, politically, spiritually, and so on. If we accept that, then we need to recognize that the ideal of invulnerability or radical self-sufficiency is a myth, and it's a problematic one, right? So this is obviously Superman radiating, he's either bouncing bullets off or radiating light from his porous soul. And this is Wonder Woman with Ayn Rand's face photoshopped over the original Wonder Woman. Ayn Rand, you may know, was a libertarian novelist. She wrote The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, among a few other stories, and considered and a philosopher, and was very radical libertarian, and tended to refer to weaklings as parasites, maybe for rhetorical flourish in her novels, maybe not, but certainly contributed in a strong and very direct way to our national discourse that can be characterized as sort of neoliberalism, right? Starve the state, make us all responsible for ourselves, and everything is a market, and the strong will prevail, and the weak will figure out where they can be useful, if anywhere. So that's Ayn Rand as Wonder Woman, and Wonder Woman was far more vulnerable, but I like this version for the purpose of this talk. So this is a contemporary discourse. It's also a discourse in the United States that has a very long history. This is the cover of Democracy in America, a book by Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville was a French aristocrat, diplomat, political theorist, political scientist, who came over on a mission from France in the early 1830s to travel all around the United States, what we would now call the Eastern United States, right, to learn how democracy was working in America and to take those lessons back to France, on the assumption that democracy had this kind of global force, and that it was coming to France, it was sort of inevitable, and how could France learn to kind of make it French and manage the excesses of democratic passion. So he came over, traveled around, and it's a very long book, but it's really great. If you're interested in reading a little political theory this summer, I highly recommend Democracy in America, because it's so timely still, and he's really, his observations about Americans are sometimes delightful, sometimes kind of mildly offensive, but really insightful. And so what Tocqueville tells us in Democracy in America is that Americans are fascinating to him because they owe nothing to any man. They expect nothing from any man. They acquire the habit of always considering themselves as standing alone, and they are apt to imagine that their whole destiny is in their own hands. And this is Tocqueville traveling around in the early 1830s, 1831 in the Eastern United States, but this description really captures so much of what we think of as the frontier mentality, sort of the rural Mountain West libertarian ethos still today. So he really captured something that Americans prided themselves on, and he was sort of both, I think, fascinated and both sort of delighted and horrified by this dimension of Americanness, right? So so that's our journey into political theory. And so, what do I want to do with this? So for me, the interesting question that comes out of thinking about medical institutional norms and practices and pressures and the history of political theory about freedom in the individual is to ask, how does this individualist, self-reliant, kind of personal responsibility aspect of the American ethos function when it enters the domain of health? meaning when the domain of health, when we personally seek treatment for things like giving birth, ailing and dying and healing, or meaning when we are mandated as part of the public to comply with public health initiatives. So when we personally seek treatment for giving birth, ailing and dying or healing, as I suggested earlier, one of the ways we see this kind of individual, self-reliant, personal responsibility discourse shape up is under the banner of choice and control, that we're hailed as kind of choice-making autonomous subjects, and we have rights and responsibilities, and it's really kind of all about our preferences and will. And so that's one way it shapes up. And as I said, that discourse breaks down for people all the time. Like, it's nothing wrong with being patient-centered, but when it rings hollow for a lot of people, or when the form it takes is, putting an informed consent form into someone's hands as they're having a contraction during labor, like, something isn't really measuring up there. And so that's one way that ethos comes in. And I think that can be really problematic. And that really what we need, and what lots of medical, anthropological, and philosophical and sociological data shows, makes health experiences in healthcare actually feel like they are self-determined and autonomous, is time on the part of the caregiver, which is probably the most precious commodity within medicine, aside from high-level expertise. So time, trust between caregiver and patient, between doctor and patient, humility on the part of both. So certainly humility on the part of the patient, who says, here are the things I want to be autonomous, and I want to participate in my care, and I want to make decisions. And also I recognize that my body might have its own plans, and there might be forces at work outside of my control. And humility on the part of the caregiver, who says, I want to recognize you as a distinct individual and figure out who I am in the context of your care, that it's not the doctor as God model, but really the doctor as partner, and partnership requires mutual humility. And that these things kind of together create a context for relational autonomy, which is not just kind of the traditional liberal individualist autonomy, but an autonomy that is premised on supportive relations and conditions, and actually cultivates competencies to have autonomy in the person, and instead of just telling them, you're autonomous, you signed this this form, you're informed, you consented, right? Relational autonomy is a much more rich and nuanced and timely and supported way of thinking about what it means to be free. And when those conditions don't hold, which they frequently don't, right? Time, trust, humility, and relational autonomy, when they don't hold, one of the things that we see, and that fascinated me in working on this book, was that not only do people grin and bear it and come out and fill out their patient satisfaction survey with all sorts of critiques. That happens a lot. But another thing that happens is the patients walk away. Right, they exit the clinic, the hospital and USA. They leave the medical institutional context and try to figure out other ways they can give birth, they can navigate death and dying, they can treat themselves for mental illness in ways that feel like they have a degree of actual control, not just kind of formal control. And so I was really interested in exit. And that ended up being where my book ended. That's the concluding chapter. Those are the sort of loose threads that lingered for me. So what is exit? What does it mean in the context of healthcare, and not, for example, I'm so angry at my bank, I'm going to go to another bank, right? Which is the traditional kind of economic context within which people talked about exit. So just to give you a sense of how political scientists talk about exit. This is a 1970 kind of a formative text in political science from 1970 by Albert O. Hirschman, called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And Hirschman defined voice as any attempt at all to change rather than escape from an objectionable state of affairs, whether through individual or collective petition to the management directly in charge, through appeal to a higher authority with the intention of forcing a change in management, or through various types of actions and protests, including those that are meant to mobilize public opinion. So that was voice, right? Using your voice, whether literally or figuratively, to lobby for change, right? Writing letters. I think, today we would think about a certain kind of voice as liking or suggesting or sharing, within social media. And then exit was something else. And voice is traditionally considered, a the preeminent political action, right? To try to make change by lobbying, persuading people. And traditionally, exit was considered kind of an economic option, right? If you weren't going to try and make change, you were just going to switch to a different product, right? So exit, walking away, or opting out, taking your business elsewhere. And the point of Hershen's book, what he set out to do was show that exit had really distinct political dimensions, and voice had some kind of economic dimensions, and economists and political scientists needed to talk to each other more and figure out why people walk away. And this is particularly important if you have a firm, but it's also important, like, if people aren't voting. Does that express a form of exit, or does it not express anything at all? So that's exit, and that's where I ended up. And the kind of exit I considered in the book was people who left kind of the labor and delivery, the obstetrics model, and opted for home birth with a midwife, or unattended home birth, which is on the rise as well, but there's not really any statistics on it. But home birth with a trained professional midwife has been on the rise for the last couple decades. People who left the curative model of the intensive care unit and said no more, and made the choice to go to hospice. And I was really interested in people who made that choice months in advance, often when their doctor said, wait, we can do a little more, and they said no, I want to make this change, and they had to kind of fight for it to get out of the highly interventionist medical managerial context. And then finally veterans who walk away from the VA and say, I don't these things aren't helping me, and I need to take kind of control of my own healing, and turned to nature. And nature in my analysis involved using medical marijuana to sort of self-medicate with something that was much more natural and mild than the pharmaceuticals they were being prescribed, or wilderness immersion therapy, or adventure therapy in nature, and then also yoga. And so I looked at all of those as sites of exit from the mainstream medical institutional context. And the question that then comes up in thinking about exit and going back to the discourse on choices, are these good choices, right? And within the mainstream medical context, they're frequently pitched as not good choices. And so so the question of choice, still really lurks there. The question of choice and control still really lurks there. But exit is one way that people try to kind of reclaim what they feel are genuine autonomous choices. So that's when people are seeking their own personal care. And then the question is, when we are mandated as part of the public to comply with public health initiatives, how does this individualist and self-reliant kind of personal responsibility aspect of the American ethos function? So how do we see ideas about autonomy and health and citizenship coming together today in this moment where we are being mandated as part of the public to comply with public health initiatives? So we're in the context of this global pandemic. We're in the context of a global pandemic when the idea of the public in the United States, this idea of we the people, or an idea of a commonwealth, is very, very weak. And we're in a moment when trust in institutions and authority is at an all-time low, and institutions including government, science, medicine, and the media, among others. So how do we see these ideas about autonomy and health and citizenship coming together now, given these factors that I'm mapping out? And so when I first started talking about this book, when I was writing, it was in development, and I would talk about exit, I always got this question: what about so-called anti-vaxxers, which is not what people who are vaccine choice activists would call themselves, but it is the kind of colloquial term we hear in the media, shorthand for that, a variety of movements, right? So people would say, what about anti-vaxxers, right? Because when you talk about exit, and you talk about sort of opting out from recommended treatments with regard to birth and death and illness, you seem to regard these choices as, ones that medical authorities are skeptical about, but which you think are kind of courageous and like self-determining and good choices. So what about anti-vaxxers? And for a long time, I didn't know how to answer the question. So that's become my next project, the one I'm just kind of digging into right now in real time while the literature is exploding daily. Or, right now this question becomes, or anti-maskers, right? How do we think about exit or self-determination that says, I won't do this thing that I'm being asked to do for the good of the whole, how do we think about that? And, again, the questions that come up are how do we decide what constitutes a good choice? Right? I mean, people who are make anti-vaccine choices or are anti-vaccine activists are really convinced that this is the best choice, right, for them and for their family. So what constitutes a good choice, right? In the context of public health initiatives like mass vaccination programs, this becomes a really complicated, it can become a complicated question. Who gets to say what constitutes a good choice, right? And again, that's that question of medical authority, which can be challenging when confidence in institutions is at an all-time low. And then what are the limits of the choice framework for private decisions and for public health? And we are hailed as choice-making consumers, we're consumer citizens, we're choice-making patients, we're consumer patients, we're consumer students. My students are constantly told to make good choices regarding the product they're purchasing, so they don't come out with a ton of debt. So there's very much where, as parents, we're hailed as, as consumers, make good consumer choices for your family. So that economic idiom and choice as the kind of primary economic action is really pervasive. And so what happens when culturally that's where we are, and then we need to make decisions either about our own private care or for public health. We, I think, have not the richest set of resources conceptually, culturally to work with to address these very pressing problems. 20% of rural Americans say they will not get the COVID vaccine. Mississippi has the highest rate with 30% who say they won't get it. There's a clear political affiliation dimension. 40% of Republicans in Mississippi say they won't get it. There's also, I think, a racial dimension in Mississippi. 38% of African American and Black folks say they won't get it. That has changed in the last couple of weeks. I think notably, Black folks in the South have a long history of being used and abused by the medical system. So there's some kind of important backstory there. And again, like I said, that has been shifting with more and more people getting vaccinated and the safety being proven. So that's vaccine resistance. Vaccine hesitancy is also a challenge. Montana has one of the highest rates of vaccine hesitancy in the country. 19% of residents say they are not sure. They're uncertain. They are skeptical. And they want to watch and wait before they get a shot. In Montana, like with mask wearing, the discourse on the vaccine, the COVID vaccine, has largely shaped up in terms of freedom from government intrusion into one's life. So that concept of negative liberty, I'm most free when you leave me alone and you don't require anything from me and you don't interfere with me. So this is a pressing question. And as I suggested just a second ago, I think the conceptual tools we have that we've inherited out of the late 20th century, early 21st century, when we think about health and citizenship, are needing to be retooled. They're not getting us necessarily where we need to go. So to wrap up, how do we rethink freedom and self-determination beyond individual choice and these kind of thin conceptions of privacy and bodily autonomy? And this is kind of where I'm headed, trying to figure this out. There are very prominent movements in the United States and in Montana today that call themselves medical freedom movements. Medical freedom movements go all the way back to the origins of the United States. The movement sometimes travels under the heading of vaccine choice movements. And I, as a political theorist, want to kind of see what happens if we rethink some of that discourse within those movements through the lens of what I would call health libertarianism. So libertarianism as a political ideology that is now sort of shaping up within health. So what if health freedom movements are now more about politics and less about medicine? What if medical resistors take their lead from hyper-partisan divisions? So instead of one body politic trying to remain healthy or healthy enough, you have essentially an autoimmune disorder, right? Where the body is attacking itself, quite literally, right? So health, freedom, and conceptions of good citizenship have always gone together. But it seems very important right now to track the changes underway, both as healthcare becomes increasingly interventionist and hyper-medicalized in the clinic, but also as the conception of the public, which is necessary to have public health, becomes increasingly at risk of demise. So those are my comments. I hope they provoked some thoughts and some questions, and I will give you a second to pull those together, and then I think we'll maybe shift from sharing the screen to me maybe being able to actually see people who ask questions. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. That was Very interesting. I feel like I learned a lot. So we did get one question just in that last part when you were talking about the of the times discussion. This is from Donna. I'm just going to read the chat. So she says, how does all this intertwine with citizen health, public health, and government laws that interfere with these entities and how they work in our better interest? Public health protects us, citizen health protects us. Lately, the government interferes with our safe care and changes the rules midstream. These are not our choices. I think you covered a little bit of it, but maybe a little more.
No, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, public health officers are the government, right? I mean, I think that's what's really challenging today is, in many states and in this very kind of divided political moment, public health officers are part of the government, and the government, meaning usually the governor and the legislature, are another part. And they have they can be at odds. We've seen that obviously in our own state. They're at odds. And so in that context, it seems particularly challenging because the idea of the choice-making, health-consuming citizen really isn't part of the discourse, right? Public opinion doesn't seem to be swaying like helping resolve that conflict. And I think that's partly because public opinion is divided. And public opinion often tracks the loudest voices. I mean, I was laughing the other day because I heard someone say, we're the silent majority. And I thought, I think you're actually the loud minority. I mean, if you could call yourself the silent majority, but I think you're actually the loud minority. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, the squeaky wheel, right, gets the grease in a way, but it does, I think, create a disproportionate sense of both the conflict itself and also what public opinion would call for. But I think the point is that public opinion can be mobilized in lots of different ways. And so the idea that we are choice-making consumers and community members who have opinions about our care, right, isn't a prominent part of that discourse. It's a great question.
Yeah, thank you, Donna. We just got another one from Gerald. I think it's Gerald. As members of society, how can we make choices or decisions in complete isolation?
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing and be a bigger
there you are.
On a luxuriously large box on my screen now. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can. And I think for me, that's where I'm struggling with sort of like the difference between public health initiatives where the decisions we make have effects on other people and some of these private health decisions that may, have costs broadly conceived, like like not wearing a seatbelt or smoking, right? Like these are things we are kind of, you have to wear a seatbelt, but you're allowed to smoke. And these can have costs, but they're really broadly conceived. And we wouldn't necessarily ban smoking on the basis of the downstream costs. But the public health challenges right now have really immediate risks and costs. So I don't think you can have a public health program that is about individuals. I mean, public health is fundamentally not about the individual, right? It's about the population. I think that's where it becomes really kind of a disconnect to use an individual choice maker language in the context of public health programs, because they're not about what any individual wants. And of course, it's very hard to say that if you're an elected official. I'm not, so I can say that. But if you're an elected official, it's probably pretty dicey to stand up and say like, hey, I don't care what you want in this regard, right? Because of course, elected officials are supposed to be very responsive to individual constituents, and we have a overwhelmingly individualist political discourse in this country. But public health is really about population management, right? And so it really isn't about individual choices. So I think that's probably what you are getting at. But I agree.
Gerald, did you have a question you wanted to ask out loud? You're welcome to raise your hand again and I can let you speak. Feel free. Oh yeah, here we go. So he's gonna unmute.
Can I ask yes, even though individual decisions such as smoking or seat belts affects the rest of society because it raises healthcare costs. If you want to smoke, I'm probably going to have to pay more insurance premiums for your care, for instance.
No, that's true, right? I mean, I think that's true. And I think there are certain contexts within which we decide that that's determinative. For some states, motorcycle helmet laws, are defended in that way. And certainly seatbelt laws are, I think really more about who else is riding in your car than the kind of cost to everyone else, particularly like that children don't have a choice about, absent the legal mandate, many children weren't wearing seatbelts. And I think that was a lot of the motivation, but I agree. And I think, that the challenge, and this is a political challenge, is to decide what we're willing to tell people they can't do because we all bear the costs, and what we're willing to say are costs that we will bear because that's the price of having, a society that also values individual freedom and choice. And so, it's an ongoing debate. And people draw that line in different places, right? And so, the political line that we draw is open to be changed over time when culture changes. But yeah, I mean, we wouldn't ban every single thing that has some sort of disparate cost for all of us, because that would, I think, feel pretty totalitarian. The question is, how much totalitarianism are you comfortable with? And some people are very comfortable with quite a lot, and other people not so much. And they have to live in a society together. So that's the challenge.
Yeah, thank you, Gerald, for that question.
Thank you.
And for following up.
Mm-hmm.
All right. We have another question. This is Elizabeth. Let's see.
I'm so lucky to ask you this question. So here it is. It's like we're seeing this debate, and the legislative session ended just a little while ago. Mm-hmm. But there's an attack on public health officers, and yet we're in a climate where local control is foremost. So how do we interpret that?
Yeah, I don't know how to interpret it in any way that makes it all, I mean, my answer is politics is how I can interpret that, right? And, pressures on politicians who have to get reelected all the time and have to have their campaigns funded. So I think there's real short-sightedness that our campaign and election system encourages, meaning like, timeline, we're kind of, but I don't know how to interpret that. To me, it seems like those two commitments are at odds, but I think for people who would defend that, they could probably give you a better answer. I mean, I think there's lots of ways in which once you distill things down to sort of sound bites and slogans, you really lose important nuance. And maybe politicians don't have to be philosophers dwelling in the land of nuance, but there's a lot of stuff today that I can't really make square rationally, but politicians don't have to. They have to persuade enough of their voters to vote for them. And so there is, I certainly don't want to call it pandering. I mean, that's one form of catering to people's, passions and desires. But I think it's just sort of the reality of being in a permanent campaign mode. And so I don't think it squares up logically, but I can understand in practice why people are comfortable making those kind of competing claims in one breath. That's sort of a diplomatic way, I guess, of answering it.
Good question, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Does anyone else have a question they want to ask out loud? That actually worked really well. That was the first time we've ever had anyone raise their hand. So thank you for going for it. We do have one that was a few that were emailed beforehand, and Annie is still here. So I want to make sure we address those. I'll read them while people are considering other questions. Feel free to drop them in the chat. So let me just pull up the email. All right, and this is from Annie. I'm going to read her email. So Annie says, greetings. I am supporting my 98-year-old mother who is living semi-independently. The hospitalist system nearly killed her several years ago, and now she refuses to go back. She will accept going to the emergency room, but refuses to be admitted to the hospital itself. Question. So this is, there's 3 questions built in. So question 1, do we have the right to emergency care, but refuse to be checked into the hospital afterwards? Do you want to do that one first, Sarah?
Yeah, I'm looking for my notes here because this is, after Sarah told me this question today, and I thought, oh no, they think I'm a real doctor. I called my friend who's an ER doctor, and I said, my hunch is yes. He said, yes, absolutely. And he actually told me about this Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act of 1986. Am EMTALA, that's how they pronounce it, EMTALA. And so EMTALA was the act that said you couldn't, you had to treat people who came to you whether they could afford it or not, and you couldn't transfer people to the public hospital if it would put their health at risk. And so what he said is, yes, it also protects your right to show up for emergency treatment and then walk away. You don't have to, you do not have to be admitted. You have a right to deny any treatment you don't want. And he said what has come out of this act is, this line that people say, like, we do have a public healthcare system. It's called the emergency room, because when you come into the emergency room under EMTALA, you basically get a full health workup, which has expanded and expanded because emergency rooms don't want to miss something and risk being sued. And so really people can get quite a lot of not only emergency, but curative and almost preventive care at the emergency level, and still walk right out. And he said, it's the speech he gives many times each day, which is, you should be admitted and you should have these procedures. And I recognize your right not to, and I'm going to respect that, but I'm going to give you every resource I can to help you before you walk out, because even though I don't think it's a good choice, I know that you're going to make it. And your health is my overwhelming concern. So I learned a lot, and thank you, Annie, for the question. I learned a lot asking my friend Timmy about that question. Yes, you can come in for full emergency care, including extensive workups of all sorts, and still get in your car and drive home when that's over.
Okay, question 2. How can we navigate around the horrible hospitalist system to get good medical care in the event a hospital stay is unavoidable? And then part 2 of question 2 is, can you leave after the fact if you get poor care again?
Yeah, right. I mean, you can decline treatment at any point and walk out. The answer to the first part of that question is something that has come about a lot in this era of patient autonomy and patient self-determination and patient advocacy, which is the patient advocate, right? So you can hire a patient advocate. You can either hire, there's some people who do this as their business, but really what I've learned from a lot of my friends who have had to navigate the healthcare system in the last couple of years, usually now that I'm in my late 40s for breast cancer and other kinds of cancers, is they say, take an advocate and take the most obnoxious relative, most obnoxious and sort of, intense relative you have, and let that person be the bad guy, and let them ask every question you might be afraid to ask, and let them kind of ask that question 5 times. And that if you have an advocate with you, you're gonna get, more direct answers, and not necessarily better treatment, but you're gonna feel better about your treatment, because you're gonna feel like, okay, I know what's going on, and someone is here distinctly for my interests. And in a moment of extreme vulnerability and confusion, I'm not in this position of having to advocate for myself, which can be asking a lot from people who are scared and doing something they've never done before and desperately don't want to be doing. So.
Yeah, that actually, I have a follow-up question, and we do have another one in the chat. But for patient advocates, I don't know a lot about them, but I've read a little bit about them in terms of working with Alzheimer's patients and dementia patients. So it's not related to that, but my question would be, you mentioned earlier in the talk that you wanted them to tell you what to do. Mm-hmm. Advocates not necessarily going to tell you what to do, but would they be more straightforward with you than your doctor, who says, no, I'm not telling you what I would tell my daughter, even if I had to?
I think the thing about the advocate is, if it's someone, particularly if you have sort of an ongoing health issue that you need to deal with, right? Or if they're a relative, it's someone you get to know over time, really. So there's a kind of autonomy that feminist philosophers write about when they're kind of exploring all the dimensions of autonomy, called relinquishing autonomy. And what they found, particularly in the context of childbirth with a trusted midwife, is that the relationship between a person giving birth and the midwife, it's so different than the relationship between a patient and a doctor. Right? So patients typically see OBs for about 10 minutes per appointment after that initial consultation. So really there's not a relationship, and that doctor might not even be at your birth. And so that trust isn't there. But with a patient advocate or with a midwife or a medical professional who you've known for a long time, you have that trust. And so it's not necessarily that they're going to then say, give up your autonomy and I'll take over for you, but that you might want to give up your autonomy and have them kind of navigate for you. Or when they tell you, I think we've run into the limits of some of your autonomy right now, that you're more inclined to think, okay, I believe you because I know you have my best interest at heart, that you aren't trying to get rid of me. You're not trying to tell me you're being obnoxious. Stop trying to be the doctor, right? That's a totally different relationship. So I think, again, that trust and time are the most important dimension of good medical care. And they're the things that are frequently the hardest to come by under the pressure of billable hours and all of that. But they really make a fundamental difference in how patients feel about the same experiences, whether they feel confused and angry because they didn't get it, or whether they feel like I understood, in the childbirth context, I understood why I had to have a C-section. I didn't want it. I said I wouldn't have it. But then my doula explained to me, look, this is what's happening. And I think this is the best thing for you. Ultimately, you can still say no, but I think this, so I think that's a totally different context of decision-making. And it's a partnership, a genuine partnership.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Gerald has another question. I think I'm curious about this too. How many individuals who exit eventually re-enter?
Yeah, so that I don't know, just as an empirical question. I am curious about that as well. And I'm not sure, short of doing my own kind of study, how I'd find out. But I am curious too, because I think, at least in the context with veterans, what is really clear is overwhelmingly veterans like their VA healthcare. They don't want to exit the VA altogether. They do want to exit for certain things, and particularly in this time of like repeat deployment, the risk of using medical marijuana legally to being able to sort of lose your benefits, being able to redeploy, makes that separation more stark. But in general, there's something that I think really looks like an exit from the dominant mental health care regimen, but does not entail an exit overall. And even mental health, many veterans who leave because they want to pursue more natural remedies come back for other things within the mental health complex. So that I think is a really clear place where it's a little more of a revolving door. But I'm not sure. I mean, I think people would be hard pressed to walk away from healthcare altogether. Although I think part of what we see in sort of the medical freedom discourse is this general idea that doctors are not trustworthy and that there's some sort of bigger kind of surveillance apparatus at work, and that in general, everything can be addressed through more natural, holistic remedies. I think you see some of that there, where there's like a genuine exit in general. But I think mostly people come back and forth.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Gerald, for that second question. That was all we had for questions. If you don't mind waiting a few more minutes, we'll see if anybody else comes up with anything in the chat. We are here officially until 7:30, so we have a little more time left. If you're waiting, don't be shy. We're here to help and go from there. But Elizabeth says, tell us how to buy your book.
Oh, you are so lovely to ask. This is the book. It's actually like a real physical object now, which feels really weird after carrying it around in my head and in my laptop for years, I think. So it is through Oxford University Press. You can buy it on Amazon. I will tell you that Oxford released it in hard copy only initially, and it's really expensive. So I'm hoping that in the next 6 months to a year, it'll be out in paperback and that'll be way more affordable. In the meantime, I would love it if people would ask their libraries to buy it, university or public libraries, if they have the resources to buy books. That is how Oxford recoups their money. Typically on the hardcover, most humans don't need a hardcover of my book, but most libraries do. So eventually you'll see the paperback copy on Amazon. Or if you are just dying to read it right now, I still have a 30% off discount code from Oxford, and you could buy it directly through them. But I really just appreciate even the desire to buy it. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
As a follow-up question, my initial impression of your book was that it was more of a textbook. Is it appropriate for lay people who are not?
I hope it is. No, it's not a textbook. It's a monograph. So it's like, it's okay. 6 chapters of one kind of book. Yes, I hope it is. I mean, it attacks between needing to and wanting to speak to a political theory audience, to persuade them that these contexts within healthcare are distinctly political and we should be studying them. So I really did want to link it to a political theory literature and concepts. But, you know, I often write with my mom in mind, who's like a, you know, very curious, you know, educated 76-year-old woman who has no particular knowledge of what I study, but is a good reader. And so I try to write like, what would my mom get this? And, you know, when she doesn't, she is the first to tell me. So she sends me a list of words. I don't know what this means. Don't use this word, which is awesome. But I do hope that it can speak across audiences and sort of satisfy different people at different parts.
Awesome. Then yeah, the Belgrade Community Library will be purchasing this and it'll be on the shelf in the next month or two. So of course, yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't buy it before we had this.
Oh no,
talk.
that's
yeah. And Elizabeth says yay.
Yay.
So, and your cards at Bozeman are good at the Belgrade Community Library. You don't have to get a separate one. Just as a public service announcement from us to you. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll let you get to your what looks like a beautiful evening still. Go for a walk in the sunset and enjoy the 80+ degree weather tomorrow.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
I see students out in front of Montana Hall in their graduation gowns taking pictures.
That's exciting.
It's that time of year.
Already, yes. Donna says, thank you for an interesting lecture. Very complicated. I agree, Donna.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah, it is a little intimidating, but I feel a little less intimidated now. So thank you, Sarah. And then Elizabeth says, this was a great talk. So before you go, everybody, you'll get a link to the survey. We really want your feedback. I read every comment and share it with the presenters. So that means a lot. And we're glad you're here. You'll get a link to the recording once OLLI uploads it to their archive system. And it'll just be through the library's YouTube channel, but you'll get a direct link through them. And Sarah, thank you. And I look forward to talking with you again soon. And yeah, we really appreciate your time. Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.